On my 18th birthday, instead of cake and celebration, my parents handed me garbage bags filled with my belongings and pointed toward the door. "You are no longer our responsibility, Sage," my mother said coldly. "Figure it out." Standing on the porch with everything I owned, watching their house lights turn off one by one, I never imagined this moment would lead to the most devastating family secret imaginable. What I discovered about my parents 3 months later would destroy everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and blood. Hey everyone. Before we dive into this incredible journey of betrayal and ultimate justice, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. If this story of family karma resonates with you, please hit that like button and do not forget to subscribe for more shocking family drama stories. Trust me, what happens next will leave you questioning everything about family loyalty. The first night on the streets taught me that hunger feels like glass shards in your stomach. I wandered downtown Phoenix until I found a 24-hour diner where the waitress Maria let me sit in a corner booth nursing a single cup of coffee until dawn. When she realized I had nowhere to go, she slipped me leftover pie and whispered the locations of safe places to sleep. That became my routine for weeks. During the day, I searched desperately for work, any work. My parents had refused to help me get my driver's license, claiming it was too expensive, so I was limited to places I could walk to. Fast food restaurants turned me away because I had no address. Retail stores wanted references I did not have. Even when I lied about having a home, my unwashed clothes and desperate demeanor gave me away. It was during my third week of homelessness that I met Eleanor Hartwell. I had been sleeping in the parking lot behind a grocery store using cardboard boxes as makeshift shelter when I noticed an elderly woman struggling with her groceries. She was probably in her 70s, thin and frail, with silver hair that caught the afternoon sunlight. Her car was an old Honda that looked like it might fall apart at any moment. Without thinking, I rushed over to help her load the heavy bags into her trunk. She looked startled at first, probably because I looked rough around the edges, but then she smiled warmly and thanked me. As she drove away, I noticed she had dropped a $20 bill near her car. I chased after her vehicle, waving the money in the air, but she was already gone. That night, I used that $20 to buy my first real meal in days, but something about her kind face stayed with me. I kept the memory close, along with the strange feeling that our paths would cross again. They did 2 days later at the same grocery store. This time, she was having trouble reaching items on high shelves. Again, I helped without being asked. She introduced herself as Eleanor and asked my name. When I told her I was Sage, she repeated it thoughtfully, as if she was filing it away for future reference. "You seem like you could use a friend," she said gently. I almost broke down crying right there in aisle 7 between the cereal and the coffee. No one had spoken to me with such genuine kindness since my parents had thrown me out. Eleanor began appearing at that grocery store every few days, always seeming to need help with something. I started timing my wanderings around her shopping schedule, desperate for those brief moments of human connection. She never asked directly about my situation, but I could see the concern in her eyes when she noticed my clothes getting dirtier or when I was obviously exhausted. One evening, I followed her home from a distance, not to be creepy, but because I was curious about this woman who showed such kindness to a stranger. She lived in a modest house in an older neighborhood, the kind of place where people still left their porch lights on for each other. The house was small but well maintained, with a garden full of flowers that somehow still bloomed despite the Arizona heat. That night, I made a decision that would change both of our lives. I had managed to earn $30 helping someone move furniture earlier that day. Instead of buying food for myself, I walked to Eleanor's house after dark and slipped the money under her door. I had noticed her counting coins at the grocery store, carefully calculating every purchase. She needed that money more than I needed another meal. The next morning, I watched from across the street as she found the money. She looked around confused, clearly trying to figure out where it came from. But instead of keeping it, she walked to her car and drove straight to the grocery store. I followed at a distance and watched through the window as she bought a bag of sandwiches, fruit, and water bottles. Then she drove to the park where she knew homeless people gathered and handed out every single item. That sealed it for me. This woman was not just kind. She was genuinely good in a way that seemed impossible in the world I had been thrust into. Every few days, whenever I managed to earn a little money, I would slip some of it under her door. Sometimes it was $5, sometimes $20. Once it was $50 I had earned helping a family move. I never signed the money or left notes. I just wanted to help her the way she had helped others. What I did not know was that Eleanor had been keeping track of these mysterious donations. She had started a notebook documenting every amount and every date. She had also installed a small security camera hoping to catch her benefactor in the act, but I was careful, always approaching her house in the dead of night, always wearing a hood pulled low over my face. Meanwhile, my situation on the streets was getting more dangerous. Other homeless individuals had started targeting me because I was young and alone. I had been robbed twice once at knife point. I was losing weight rapidly, and the Arizona sun was taking a brutal toll on my skin. Some nights I seriously considered calling my parents, begging them to take me back, promising to be whatever they wanted me to be. But then I would think about Eleanor's kindness, about the way she had shared her own struggles without complaint, and I would find the strength to keep going. She had become my beacon of hope in a world that seemed determined to break me down completely. I had no idea that helping her would eventually lead me to uncover the most devastating truth about my own family. I had no idea that Eleanor Hartwell was not just a random kind stranger, but someone whose life was intimately connected to mine in ways I could never have imagined. The money I was slipping under her door was about to set in motion a chain of events that would expose decades of lies, fraud, and betrayal that reached all the way back to my own parents. 6 weeks into my life on the streets, everything changed because of a rainstorm. Arizona does not get much rain, but when it does, it comes down like the sky is falling apart. I was caught in a flash flood while trying to reach my usual sleeping spot behind the grocery store. The water was rising fast, and I was genuinely scared for my life when I heard someone calling my name. Eleanor was standing in her doorway, beckoning me toward her house. She was wearing a bathrobe and rain boots, completely soaked from running out to find me. "Get in here before you drown," she shouted over the thunder. I did not hesitate. I ran toward her porch like my life depended on it, which it probably did. Inside her warm, dry house, Eleanor handed me towels and made hot tea while I changed into some of her late husband's clothes that she had kept in storage. The house smelled like lavender and old books, and for the first time in weeks I felt safe. We sat in her living room listening to the storm rage outside, and she finally asked the question I had been dreading. "Sage, honey, where are your parents?" I broke down completely. Through tears and hiccups, I told her everything. How my parents had kicked me out on my birthday without explanation. How they had refused to help me get identification or find work. How they had blocked my phone number when I tried to call them. Eleanor listened without judgment, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand or offer more tea. When I finished my story, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that confused me. "Your last name," she said slowly. "What is your last name?" "Morrison," I replied. "Sage Morrison." Eleanor went completely white. She stood up abruptly and walked to a cabinet in the corner of the room. She pulled out a thick folder filled with papers and photographs, her hands shaking as she spread them across her coffee table. What I saw made my heart stop. There were photographs of my parents from what looked like 20 years ago. Pictures of them at parties, at business meetings, and in some photos they were standing with Eleanor and a man I did not recognize. But these were not the parents I knew. In these photos, my mother and father looked wealthy, confident, wearing expensive clothes and jewelry I had never seen them own. "Your parents," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, "are David and Patricia Morrison." I nodded, completely bewildered. Eleanor sat back down heavily, as if the weight of this revelation was too much to bear standing up. She pointed to the man in the photograph standing next to her. "This is my late husband, Robert Hartwell. These photos were taken before you were born, when your parents and my husband were business partners." My world tilted sideways. Business partners. My parents own a small accounting firm. They always said money was tight. They made me work part-time jobs since I was 14 to help pay for groceries. Eleanor's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Honey, your parents are millionaires. Or at least they should be. 20 years ago, Robert and your parents started a real estate investment company together. They pooled their money and bought properties all over Phoenix. The business was incredibly successful." She pulled out bank statements and legal documents, pointing to numbers that made my eyes widen. "Look at these partnership agreements. Look at these property deeds. Your parents were supposed to split everything 3 ways with Robert when they dissolved the partnership. But when Robert got sick with cancer 15 years ago, something changed." The papers told a story of systematic betrayal that made my stomach turn. While Eleanor's husband was undergoing chemotherapy and too weak to manage the business, my parents had slowly transferred properties into their own names. They had forged signatures, manipulated documents, and essentially stolen Robert's share of their joint empire. By the time Robert was strong enough to fight back, they had covered their tracks too well, Eleanor continued. They claimed he had signed over his shares willingly, that he had agreed to sell out his portion to cover medical expenses. They had lawyers and false documents to back up their story. I stared at the evidence spread across Eleanor's coffee table, feeling sick. But surely there were records proof that they stole from him. Robert tried for years to expose them, but your parents are smart. They had moved money through multiple accounts, created false paper trails, even bribed a few officials to look the other way. By the time Robert died 3 years ago, we had spent our life savings on lawyers and gotten nowhere. The room was spinning around me. Everything I thought I knew about my parents was a lie. They were not struggling small business owners barely making ends meet. They were wealthy criminals who had stolen from their dying business partner and then systematically destroyed any evidence of their crimes. "Eleanor," I said slowly, "when Robert died, what happened to his legal case against my parents?" She pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first. "I inherited everything, including all of Robert's evidence against your parents. But I am just one old woman with no money for lawyers. Your parents know I cannot afford to fight them anymore. They think they have won." As the pieces clicked together in my mind, a cold realization washed over me. They kicked me out because I turned 18. They were afraid I might find out the truth somehow. Eleanor nodded grimly. "Adult children can ask questions, access records, notice inconsistencies. As long as you were a minor under their control, they could keep you in the dark. But once you became legally independent, you became a liability. I thought about all the times my parents had insisted we were poor, how they had made me feel guilty for every dollar they spent on me. I remembered my father's lectures about being grateful for what we had, my mother's constant complaints about money being tight. All of it had been lies designed to keep me from questioning why we lived so modestly despite their successful accounting business. "There is something else," Eleanor said quietly. She pulled out one final document, and when I saw it, everything made horrible sense. It was a life insurance policy in Robert's name with my parents listed as beneficiaries. But that was not the shocking part. The shocking part was the date it was taken out, just 6 months before Robert's cancer diagnosis. They knew he was going to get sick. I asked, my voice barely audible. "I think they did more than know," Eleanor replied. "I think they helped make it happen." And the storm outside had calmed, but inside Eleanor's living room a different kind of tempest was brewing. I was no longer just a homeless teenager trying to survive on the streets. I was the daughter of criminals, and I had evidence that could destroy them. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The morning after the storm, Eleanor and I sat at her kitchen table surrounded by 20 years' worth of documents, and I finally understood why my mysterious cash donations had meant so much to her. She was not just struggling financially because she was elderly and alone. She was broke because my parents had systematically stolen her family's wealth and then spent years covering their tracks with expensive lawyers and bribes. "Every dollar you slipped under my door," she said, tears in her eyes, "helped me eat that week. I had been surviving on soup and crackers for months, trying to save every penny in case I found a lawyer willing to take Robert's case." The guilt hit me like a physical blow. While I had been feeling sorry for myself about being kicked out, this woman had been slowly starving because of my parents' crimes. But Eleanor quickly reassured me that I was not responsible for their actions and that my kindness had been the first spark of hope she had felt in years. We spent the next 3 days going through every document, organizing them chronologically, and creating a timeline of exactly how my parents had executed their fraud. The pattern was methodical and sophisticated. They had not just stolen money, they had orchestrated a complete financial assassination of their business partner. It started with small property transfers that Robert had legitimately signed while he was healthy, giving my parents temporary power of attorney to handle day-to-day business matters. But once Robert became ill, they began forging his signature on major property deeds. They sold buildings that belonged to the partnership and transferred the proceeds to personal accounts. When Robert questioned discrepancies, they showed him falsified financial statements that made it look like the properties had lost value or been sold at losses to cover business expenses. The most damning evidence was a series of checks that Robert had supposedly signed agreeing to sell his partnership shares to my parents for far below market value. Eleanor had the original canceled checks. And when we compared the signatures to legitimate documents signed by Robert, the forgeries were obvious. My parents had practiced his signature until they could replicate it perfectly, but they had made small mistakes in letter spacing and pressure that would be visible to a forensic handwriting expert. But the insurance policy was the smoking gun that elevated this from theft to something much darker. Eleanor showed me Robert's medical records from his annual physical the year before his cancer diagnosis. He had been in perfect health. No family history of cancer, no risk factors, no symptoms. Yet my parents had convinced him to dramatically increase his life insurance coverage with themselves as beneficiaries, claiming it was a smart business move for the partnership. 6 months later, Robert was diagnosed with an aggressive form of liver cancer that doctors said was extremely rare and usually only seen in people who had been exposed to specific industrial toxins. Robert had never worked in any industry that would have exposed him to such chemicals. But my father had a degree in chemistry from college, something I had only learned about a few years ago when I found his old diploma in the attic. "Eleanor," I said, studying the medical timeline, "do you remember Robert eating or drinking anything unusual in the months before his diagnosis? Did my parents ever bring food to your house or invite him out for meals?" She thought for a moment, then her face went pale. "Your father started bringing Robert special imported coffee beans around that time. He said they were from some rare plantation in South America and that they were supposed to have health benefits. Robert drank that coffee every morning for months before he got sick." And we looked at each other across the kitchen table, both thinking the same horrible thought. My parents had not just stolen from their business partner. They had slowly poisoned him to death and then collected insurance money on top of stealing his business assets. This was not just fraud, it was premeditated murder. The next step was figuring out how to expose them without getting ourselves killed in the process. If my parents were capable of murdering Robert, they would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose them. Eleanor and I were now the only people alive who knew the truth, and that made us incredibly dangerous to them. We decided our best strategy was to gather additional evidence while staying completely off my parents' radar. Eleanor still had keys to some of the properties that had belonged to the original partnership buildings that my parents now claimed to own outright. If we could get inside and find original documents, contracts, or financial records that contradicted their official story, we could build an even stronger case. Our first break-in was at a small office building downtown that had been Robert's favorite property. According to the forged documents, Robert had sold his share of this building to my parents for $20,000. But Eleanor remembered Robert saying it was worth at least $500,000, and recent property assessments confirmed he had been right. Inside the building's basement storage room, we found boxes of original partnership documents that my parents had obviously forgotten about. These papers showed the real financial value of the properties, the actual agreements between the partners, and most importantly, they contained Robert's genuine signatures that we could use to prove the later documents were forged. But the most shocking discovery came when we broke into my parents' accounting office late one night. Using Eleanor's knowledge of where Robert used to keep important papers, we searched until we found a locked filing cabinet hidden behind a false wall. Inside that cabinet were documents that revealed the true scope of their crimes. My parents had not just stolen from Robert. Over the past 15 years, they had been systematically defrauding dozens of their accounting clients, elderly people who trusted them to manage their finances. They had been skimming money from retirement accounts, transferring assets to shell companies they controlled, and in several cases they had apparently forged wills to make themselves beneficiaries when their clients died. The file contained death certificates, falsified financial statements, and what appeared to be a ledger tracking which clients had been processed and how much money had been extracted from their estates. Some of the amounts were staggering. They had stolen over $3 million from one elderly woman alone, transferring her entire life savings to offshore accounts after she died in a suspicious car accident. Eleanor and I realized we were looking at evidence of a criminal organization that had been operating for over a decade. My parents were not just thieves. They were serial killers who targeted elderly people with substantial assets, gained their trust through their accounting business, and then systematically robbed and murdered them. As we photographed every document and made copies of the most important evidence, I felt a mixture of horror and determination building inside me. These people had raised me, fed me, tucked me in at night when I was small. But they had also spent years lying to my face while they murdered innocent people for money. They had kicked me out on my 18th birthday because they were afraid I might accidentally discover their crimes and interfere with their operation. The irony was devastating. By throwing me out and forcing me to live on the streets, they had led me directly to Eleanor, the one person who could help me expose them. By making me desperate enough to slip money under her door, they had created the connection that would ultimately destroy them. We now had enough evidence to send them to prison for life, possibly even to death row. But we also knew that simply turning this information over to the police might not be enough. My parents had clearly been bribing officials for years, and they had enough money to hire the best lawyers in the country. We needed to be smart about how we exposed them, and we needed to make sure the evidence was so overwhelming and so public that they could not buy their way out of consequences. The plan we developed would require patience, precision, and perfect timing. But if it worked, it would not only bring justice for Robert and all their other victims, it would also ensure that my parents spent the rest of their lives paying for their crimes in the most appropriate way possible. How are you feeling about this story so far? The layers of betrayal and the building tension between Sage and her criminal parents is getting intense. Let me know if you want me to continue with Parts 5, 6, and 7, where everything comes crashing down and justice is finally served. Eleanor and I spent 2 months carefully orchestrating the perfect trap. We knew my parents were too smart and too well connected to be brought down by simply handing evidence to local police. They had been covering their tracks for 15 years, and they had enough money to buy their way out of almost any legal trouble. We needed something bigger. something that would create so much public attention that they could not silence or bribe their way out of consequences. Our breakthrough came when Eleanor remembered that Robert had once mentioned an investigative journalist named Marcus Chen, who had been looking into financial crimes targeting elderly victims. Marcus worked for the Arizona Republic and had won awards for exposing corruption in local government. More importantly, he was known for being incorruptible and for protecting his sources no matter what kind of pressure he faced. I made contact with Marcus through an encrypted email account claiming to have information about a major financial crime ring. He agreed to meet us at a diner outside Phoenix, somewhere my parents would never think to look for me. When Eleanor and I showed him just a fraction of our evidence, his eyes lit up like he had just discovered buried treasure. "This is not just a story," he said, flipping through photographs of forged documents and falsified death certificates. "This is a federal case that could expose corruption in banks, insurance companies, and local government offices. How many victims do you think there are?" We showed him our complete list. Eleanor and I had spent weeks cross-referencing my parents' client files with obituaries and property transfers. We had identified at least 37 elderly victims whose deaths had directly benefited my parents financially. The total amount stolen was close to $15 million money that had been systematically transferred to offshore accounts in countries with strict banking privacy laws. Marcus wanted to publish immediately, but Eleanor convinced him to wait. We had a better plan, one that would ensure maximum impact and prevent my parents from fleeing the country before they could be arrested. We were going to expose them at the annual Phoenix Business Leaders Gala, an event my parents attended every year to maintain their respectable public image. The gala was still 3 weeks away, which gave us time to prepare everything perfectly. Marcus would publish his investigation the morning of the event, ensuring that every business leader, politician, and potential investor in Phoenix would read about my parents' crimes before attending the dinner, where my parents expected to be honored for their charitable contributions to the community. But we wanted to do more than just embarrass them in the newspaper. Eleanor had discovered that my parents were planning to announce a major donation to a children's hospital at the gala money that we knew had been stolen from their victims. We were going to make sure that announcement became their public confession instead. I reached out to several family members of their victims, people whose grandparents or parents had died under suspicious circumstances after becoming clients of Morrison Accounting. Once these families saw our evidence, they were eager to help us expose the truth. We organized them to attend the gala as guests of various other attendees, ensuring that when the truth came out, the victims' families would be there to confront my parents face to face. The most crucial part of our plan involved getting inside my parents' house to plant recording devices before the gala. We needed to capture them discussing their crimes, planning their escape routes, or ideally confessing to specific murders. I still had my house key from before they kicked me out, and I knew their security system codes because they had never bothered to change them. Breaking into my childhood home felt surreal and terrifying. Everything looked exactly the same as if I had never lived there at all. My bedroom had been converted into a home office, and all traces of my existence had been erased. But I was not there for sentimental reasons. I was there to plant tiny recording devices in their bedroom home office and kitchen places where they felt safe enough to speak freely about their criminal activities. The recordings we captured over the next week were even more damning than we had hoped. My parents talked openly about their plans to eliminate Eleanor before she could cause them any trouble. They discussed bribing a judge to dismiss any potential charges. Most shocking of all, they laughed about Robert's death and reminisced about how easy it had been to poison him with contaminated coffee beans. But the conversation that broke my heart was when they talked about me. My mother expressed relief that I was probably dead on the streets by now, saying that having a daughter had always been an inconvenience to their business operations. My father agreed, adding that they should have gotten rid of me years earlier instead of waiting until I turned 18. Listening to my own parents casually discuss my death while planning to murder another innocent person crystallized my resolve. These were not people who had made mistakes or gotten caught up in circumstances beyond their control. They were calculating predators who enjoyed causing pain and had built their entire lives around victimizing vulnerable people. The night before the gala, we made our final preparations. Marcus had his article ready to publish at 6 in the morning, time to hit the internet just as Phoenix's business community was drinking their morning coffee. Eleanor had contacted the FBI with copies of all our evidence, providing them with enough probable cause to obtain arrest warrants. The victims' families were prepared to confront my parents publicly at the gala. Most importantly, I had written a letter that would be delivered to my parents just as they arrived at the hotel for the dinner. The letter would inform them that I was alive, that I knew everything about their crimes, and that their entire world was about to collapse around them. I wanted them to spend their last few hours of freedom knowing that their own daughter had orchestrated their downfall. As I sealed that letter, I thought about how different my life might have been if my parents had been the people they pretended to be. If they had actually loved me instead of seeing me as a liability to be discarded. If they had used their intelligence and business skills to help people instead of destroying them. But I also thought about Eleanor, about the strength and grace she had shown while struggling to survive on the money I had slipped under her door. I thought about Robert, who had trusted the wrong people and paid for that trust with his life. I thought about all the elderly victims who had spent their final years being systematically robbed by people they considered friends. Tomorrow night at the Phoenix Business Leaders Gala, justice would finally be served. My parents would learn that karma had been watching them all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. They had thrown away their daughter on her 18th birthday, never imagining that this act of cruelty would set in motion the very chain of events that would destroy everything they had built through murder and theft. The homeless girl they had discarded was about to bring down their entire criminal empire. The morning of the Phoenix Business Leaders Gala dawned clear and bright, but I felt like I was living inside a storm cloud. Marcus's article had gone live at 6 in the morning as planned, and by 8 o'clock it was trending on every social media platform in Arizona. The headline read, "Respected Phoenix accountants accused of 15-year murder and fraud scheme targeting elderly clients." Eleanor and I watched the story explode across the internet, from her living room constantly refreshing news websites and social media feeds. Local television stations picked up the story by 9 in the morning. By noon, national news outlets were calling it one of the most sophisticated financial crime rings ever uncovered in the Southwest. The FBI had issued a statement confirming they were investigating the allegations, and Phoenix police had surrounded my parents' house and accounting office. But my parents were nowhere to be found. They had apparently left their house before dawn, probably tipped off by one of their corrupt contacts in local law enforcement. For a few terrifying hours, Eleanor and I worried that they had fled the country and would escape justice entirely. Then we remembered the gala. My parents were creatures of habit and ego. They had been planning to attend this event for months, preparing to announce their fake charitable donation and bask in the admiration of Phoenix's elite. Even with their crimes exposed, their narcissism would not let them miss this opportunity to play the victim and try to manipulate public opinion in their favor. At 4 in the afternoon, hotel security confirmed that David and Patricia Morrison had checked into the Phoenician resort using fake names, but paying with the credit card that Marcus had been monitoring. They were still planning to attend the gala, apparently believing they could somehow talk their way out of the charges or convince people that they were being framed. Eleanor and I arrived at the hotel separately, both wearing disguises in case my parents spotted us before we were ready to confront them. I had dyed my hair black and was wearing glasses and a formal dress that Eleanor had bought me for the occasion. She had traded her usual casual clothes for an elegant black gown that made her look like the wealthy widow she should have been if my parents had not stolen her life savings. The gala was being held in the hotel's grand ballroom, a massive space filled with Phoenix's most powerful business leaders, politicians, and social elite. These were exactly the kind of people my parents had spent years impressing with their false charitable work and fabricated success stories. Tonight, they would learn the truth about the couple they had welcomed into their exclusive social circle. When my parents made their entrance at 7:30, the reaction was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people recognized them from the morning's news coverage. Some guests pulled out their phones to take photos while others whispered frantically to their companions. My parents seemed oblivious to the hostile attention, smiling and waving as if nothing had changed. They made it about halfway across the ballroom before the first victim's family member confronted them. Margaret Chen, whose grandmother had died under suspicious circumstances 3 years ago, walked directly up to my mother and said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "Patricia Morrison, you murdered my grandmother and stole her life savings." The ballroom went completely silent. My father tried to brush past Margaret, claiming she was obviously confused, but she held up a photograph of her grandmother with my parents at a charity event, along with copies of the forged documents that had transferred her grandmother's assets to my parents' control just days before her death. That opened the floodgates. One by one, family members of other victims approached my parents, each carrying evidence of their loved ones' murders and the subsequent theft of their estates. The crowd of Phoenix's elite watched in fascination and horror as the full scope of my parents' crimes was laid out in excruciating detail by people whose lives had been destroyed by their greed. My parents tried to maintain their composure, claiming they were being set up by jealous competitors, but their panic was becoming obvious. My father kept checking his phone, probably looking for escape routes or trying to contact their corrupt allies for help. My mother's fake smile was becoming more strained with each new accusation. Then Eleanor stepped forward, and my parents' faces went completely white. They clearly thought she was either dead or too broken to fight back. Seeing her dressed elegantly and surrounded by allies must have been like seeing a ghost rise from the grave to haunt them. "David," Eleanor said in a voice that carried across the silent ballroom, "you look surprised to see me. Did you think I would quietly die of starvation like you planned?" The crowd gasped audibly. Eleanor held up the photographs we had taken of forged documents, falsified insurance claims, and my parents' handwritten notes about eliminating potential witnesses. She spoke clearly and calmly, telling the assembled business leaders exactly how my parents had murdered her husband and stolen their life's work. But the moment that brought everything crashing down was when I stepped out of the crowd and walked toward my parents. They had not seen me since the night they kicked me out, and the shock on their faces was absolute. My mother actually stumbled backward, as if I was a hallucination that might disappear if she blinked hard enough. "Hello, Mom. Hello, Dad," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I got your message loud and clear on my 18th birthday. You made it very clear that I was not welcome in your family anymore. But you forgot something important." I pulled out copies of the recordings we had made in their house, along with photographs of all their victims and evidence of their offshore bank accounts. "You forgot that throwing me out would lead me to Eleanor. You forgot that your own cruelty would be the thing that finally brought you down." The ballroom erupted in chaos. Hotel security was trying to maintain order while FBI agents who had been waiting outside moved in to make arrests. My parents tried to run, but they were surrounded by their victims' families, angry business leaders who felt betrayed, and law enforcement officers with handcuffs ready. As the FBI agents read them their rights, my mother looked at me with pure hatred and screamed, "You ungrateful little bitch! We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us." I looked her directly in the eyes and said, "You gave me nothing but lies. But thank you for teaching me exactly what kind of person I never want to become." That was the last thing I ever said to my parents. Within an hour, they were in federal custody charged with multiple counts of murder, fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. Their assets were frozen, their offshore accounts were being traced, and their network of corrupt officials was beginning to unravel. 6 months later, I stood in the same federal courthouse where my parents had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But this time I was not there as a witness or victim. I was there as Eleanor's officially adopted daughter, signing papers that would make our chosen family legal and permanent. The trial had been a media sensation that lasted 3 months. Prosecutors had used our evidence to build an airtight case that exposed not just my parents' crimes, but an entire network of corruption that reached into banks, insurance companies, and local government offices. 12 people were ultimately convicted, including 2 judges, a police captain, and several bank executives who had helped my parents launder their stolen money. My parents had tried every legal maneuver possible to escape justice. They hired the most expensive lawyers in the country, claimed they were being framed by jealous competitors, and even attempted to argue that I had fabricated evidence against them out of teenage spite. But the forensic evidence was overwhelming, and the testimony from victims' families was devastating. When the judge read their sentences, my parents showed no remorse whatsoever. My father glared at me from across the courtroom like he was planning revenge even from behind bars. My mother wept, but only because she was facing life in prison, not because she felt guilty about the people she had murdered and robbed. But their conviction was just the beginning of justice being served. The federal government had seized all of their assets, including properties, bank accounts, and investments worth over $20 million. That money was being distributed to the families of their victims, providing some measure of financial compensation for decades of loss and grief. Eleanor received the largest settlement not just for Robert's stolen share of the business partnership, but for pain and suffering caused by his murder. She used some of that money to establish a foundation that provides legal assistance to elderly people who are being financially exploited. She also bought back Robert's favorite property, the downtown office building, where we had found our first crucial evidence, and converted it into apartments for homeless young adults aging out of foster care. For myself, I used the settlement money to do something my parents had never allowed. I went to college. I enrolled at Arizona State University to study forensic accounting, determined to use my knowledge of financial crimes to help other victims seek justice. Eleanor insisted on paying for my education as well, saying that watching me grow and succeed was worth more to her than any amount of money. Living with Eleanor had healed wounds I did not even know I carried. She taught me what unconditional love actually looked like, how families were supposed to support each other through difficult times, and how to build relationships based on trust rather than fear. She celebrated my achievements, comforted me when I had nightmares about my parents, and never once made me feel like I was a burden or an inconvenience. The most surprising development was how many other families reached out to us after the trial. Dozens of people who suspected their elderly relatives had been murdered by financial predators contacted our foundation asking for help investigating suspicious deaths and missing assets. Eleanor and I were building a network of investigators, lawyers, and forensic experts dedicated to exposing these crimes and bringing justice to families who had given up hope. My parents had spent years stealing from vulnerable people, but their ultimate victims had turned their pain into purpose. We were not just seeking revenge, we were creating systemic change that would protect future victims and honor the memory of everyone they had killed. The irony was perfect and complete. By throwing me out on my 18th birthday, my parents had created the very circumstances that led to their downfall. By making me desperate enough to slip money under Eleanor's door, they had forged the alliance that would destroy their criminal empire. By choosing cruelty over love, they had lost everything they had spent decades building through murder and theft. But perhaps the sweetest justice was seeing how their victims' families had transformed their grief into action. Margaret Chin had become an advocate for stronger protections for elderly investors. Robert's nephew had started a scholarship fund for students studying criminal justice. Every family affected by my parents' crimes had found ways to ensure that their loved ones' deaths would prevent future tragedies. On the anniversary of the night my parents kicked me out, Eleanor and I drove past our old house, which had been seized by the government and sold to pay victim restitution. A young family with small children lived there now, and I could see toys scattered across the yard and hear laughter coming from the backyard. That house, which had been a prison of lies for 18 years, was now filled with genuine happiness. As we drove away, Eleanor reached over and squeezed my hand. "Sage," she said, "do you ever regret how everything happened? Do you ever wish your parents had been different people?" I thought about that question for a long moment, watching Phoenix's skyline fade in the rearview mirror. "No," I finally said. "If they had been different people, I never would have met you. I never would have learned what real love looks like. All those people they hurt would never have gotten justice, and they would still be out there destroying more lives." Eleanor smiled and nodded. "Besides," she added with a mischievous grin, "karma has a perfect sense of timing. They spent years believing they were untouchable, and it was their own daughter who brought them down." Robert would have loved that irony. As we drove home to the house we now shared, I realized that my parents had been wrong about everything. They had taught me that family was about blood and obligation, but Eleanor had shown me that family was about choice and commitment. They had tried to raise me to be weak and dependent, but their cruelty had made me strong and resourceful. They had believed that money and power could protect them from consequences, but justice had found them anyway. Most importantly, they had thrown me away thinking I was worthless, never imagining that the homeless girl sleeping behind grocery stores would grow up to become the forensic accountant who would spend her career hunting down financial predators just like them. The girl they had discarded on her 18th birthday had not just survived their betrayal. She had thrived, found real love with a chosen family, and turned their legacy of pain into a force for justice that would outlast their criminal empire by generations. Have you ever experienced family betrayal that completely changed how you see relationships and trust? What would you do if you discovered your parents were criminals who had been lying to you your entire life? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let me know what lessons from my story resonate most with your own family experiences. If this journey of finding justice and chosen family touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about overcoming betrayal and building the life you deserve. Share this with anyone who needs to remember that family loyalty should never protect people who cause harm, and that sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the family we were born into. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with me, and remember that no matter how dark things seem, karma and justice have perfect timing. Stay strong, choose love over fear, and never give up on finding the family that will celebrate your worth instead of discarding it.